Now beginning. Story 1. The Baby Thief, Hermes and the Stolen Cattle of Apollo. On the slopes of Mount Cyllene in the rugged region of Arcadia, Maia gave birth in silence. She was not just any woman, she was a nymph and daughter of Atlas. The child she bore, Hermes, was not to be just any child. He was the son of Zeus, king of the gods, and on the very day of his birth, Hermes would embark on one of the strangest careers in divine history, that of a messenger, a guide, and most peculiarly, a thief. You might imagine gods were born with a bit of drama, lightning maybe, or a chorus of muses, but Hermes was born quietly in a cave, wrapped in simple cloth, and left if only briefly under the watchful eye of his sleeping mother. He did not cry long. In fact, Hermes' early silence may be the first clue that his was a mind already working, already planning. Most bobbies can't walk within minutes of birth. Hermes could. Most bobbies don't invent musical instruments before teething. Hermes did. And that very night, he would commit one of the first documented acts of divinely sanctioned mischief. He would steal Apollo's sacred cattle. The birthplace, a cave in Arcadia. Arcadia is not a region often celebrated for its dramatic wars or royal palaces. It is mountainous, forested, and stubbornly pastoral. To modern eyes, it might appear scenic, perfect for sleep. But in the ancient world, it was deeply rural and ideal for a god who thrived in movement, in boundaries, and in margins. The cave where Maia gave birth was not grand. It was probably dark, cold, and entirely unremarkable to passers-by. This, again, fits Hermes. His life would be lived not in temples of marble but at thresholds, crossroads, and borders. He was not a god of permanence. He was a god of transition. Invention before infancy. Before he ever laid hands on a cow, Hermes set his curious eyes on a tortoise. In one of the earliest stories about him told in the Homeric hymn to Hermes, a long and somewhat sleepy poem from perhaps the 6th century BCE, Hermes finds a tortoise shell, empties it of its contents with more enthusiasm than compassion, and strings it with sheep gut to create the first lyre. This was not just any act of musical curiosity. It was a calculated invention. The lyre would become his bargaining chip in an act of divine negotiation later, once the cattle were stolen and the wrath of Apollo loomed over him. Imagine the practicality here. In a single day, Hermes invented a musical instrument, orchestrated a heist, and began laying the groundwork for diplomacy, all before sunset. The stolen cattle. The theft itself is almost tedious in its detail, which makes it perfect for our sleepy exploration. Hermes found the herd near the banks of the Alpheus River, sacred to Apollo. He knew exactly what he was doing. The theft was not casual, it was engineered. He reversed the hooves of the cattle so they walked backward, leaving a false trail. He also wore sandals made from tamarisk branches to obscure his own footprints. These are not the sandals of flashy mythology. They're awkward, functional, and probably uncomfortable. But they worked. At this point, it's worth pausing to appreciate Hermes' motivations. He did not need the cattle. He had no known craving for livestock and certainly no property on which to keep them. The act was symbolic, a challenge to Apollo's domain. It was, above all else, a test of Hermes' own cunning. But what does it mean to reverse the hooves of a herd? It's a time-consuming task, fiddly and frustrating, especially if you're doing it alone. It requires a patience rarely granted to gods or humans for that matter. And it hints at something deep within Hermes, not just cleverness but persistence. The hidden herd. Hermes drove the cattle backward all the way to a small cave or grove, hidden in a remote region far from Apollo's view. He killed 2 of them, some say 12, and offered them as a sacrifice. Oddly, he didn't eat the meat. In fact, he devised the sacrificial ritual itself without indulging in its fruits. This suggests something quietly significant. Hermes wasn't acting on hunger. He was establishing his place in the divine order, carving out a domain in ritual and sacrifice that would later make him a god to whom merchants, thieves and travelers would offer prayers. He divided the carcasses with mathematical precision, 12 portions, presumably one for each Olympian god. Though he himself was not yet formally welcomed into that group, he already assumed he had a place at the table. This arrogance, or was it foresight, would soon be tested. Apollo's realization. Of course, Apollo noticed. One doesn't simply misplace sacred cattle. But here, where the story turns quietly absurd, Apollo, god of prophecy, light, and music, could not track down the thief using his usual divine powers. He had to follow the physical trail, confusing as it was, and eventually found himself in the same cave in Arcadia, face to face with Maya and a suspiciously innocent newborn. Hermes, wrapped in his infant blanket, denied everything. With all the wide-eyed innocence of a guilty toddler, he insisted he'd been asleep all night. He had no idea what Apollo was talking about. Surely the god of truth must have misunderstood. It was so bold, so hilariously implausible, that Apollo didn't know what to do. So, like any offended party in the divine world, he took the matter to Zeus. Zeus the arbitrator. Zeus, amused rather than angry, sided with neither son. Instead, he asked Hermes to return the cattle and to apologize, something which Hermes did, but not before charming his way out of punishment. How? With the lyre. When Hermes presented the lyre to Apollo, its music softened the sun god's fury. In a quiet moment that feels far removed from the drama of other myths, Apollo accepted the gift and, in turn, gave Hermes a staff, later the famous caduceus, symbolizing peace and negotiation. This was not just an exchange of objects. It was a symbolic transfer of roles. Hermes gave music and received diplomacy. And yet, for all the drama of this event, we're left wondering, was this really a story about theft? Or was it a story about how gods find their place in the world through cleverness, persistence, and a little bit of manipulation? When we left off, Hermes, just a day old, had stolen Apollo's sacred cattle, reversed their hooves, invented the lyre, and successfully lied to both Apollo and Zeus. This peculiar blend of mischief and creativity wasn't just a quirky one-off. It was the beginning of something more enduring. Hermes' portfolio as a god of boundaries, negotiations, and transitions. Let's now explore the consequences of this act, not just the resolution of the theft, but the establishment of Hermes, responsibilities on Olympus, the tools he acquired, and the role he began to carve out in the otherwise rigid hierarchy of the gods. A lyre for a herd, the first divine deal. The Homeric hymn to Hermes, our primary and surprisingly detailed source for this myth, paints a picture of Apollo not as an enraged deity bent on punishment, but as a god intrigued by this younger sibling's charm. When Hermes offered the lyre, a 7-stringed instrument made from the shell of a tortoise, strung with sheep gut and fashioned with expert care, Apollo was mesmerized. In his domain of light and music, this was no small gesture. The instrument didn't just make sound, it made music. Apollo, god of the lyre before there even was one, accepted the gift. In return, he offered Hermes several things, one of which was a golden staff destined to become the famous courier or caduceus, a winged rod entwined with 2 snakes. But even more than the staff, Apollo granted Hermes a formal role among the gods. He would be the god of herdsmen, traders, and messengers. He would watch over travelers, escort souls to the underworld, and maintain the smooth operation of Olympus's communications network, a bureaucracy more complicated than one might expect for a pantheon of immortals. In this strange exchange, lyre for cattle, cattle for peace, staff for role, Hermes solidified his place in the world not through war or prophecy, but through negotiation. The tools of the trade. Each god has a signature item or symbol that defines their power and authority. Zeus had his thunderbolt, Poseidon his trident, Athena her spear and helmet. Hermes would, in time, gather several of his own, none of them destructive, all of them practical. The Corycian caduceus. Originally a simple herald's staff, the caduceus came to symbolize negotiation and balance. Later, in Roman times, it would be confused with the rod of Asclepius and become a symbol of medicine, which is a bit ironic considering Hermes wasn't exactly a healer. But in the Greek tradition, it represented his role as a mediator and communicator. Talaria winged sandals. These enabled Hermes to fly not in dramatic, cape-fluttering arcs, but in smooth, silent motion across sky and sea. Ancient depictions often show him airborne, heels aloft, a literal go-between. Petasso's winged cap. A soft, wide-brimmed hat that kept the sun off, especially important for long journeys. The wings were more symbolic than aerodynamic, representing speed, travel, and the crossing of boundaries. The traveler's cloak chlamys. A simple, short cloak tied over one shoulder. It was utilitarian, not grand, and marked Hermes as a god of movement and utility, not of courtly appearances or temple grandeur. All of these tools served one purpose: to move between places. Whether between worlds, cities, or even between gods, Hermes was never still. Boundaries and thresholds. Hermes' role in Greek life, both mythical and everyday, was deeply tied to liminality. A liminal space is a boundary, a threshold. Not quite one thing, not quite another. Hermes lived in these spaces. Crossroads were sacred to him. Offerings, often food, coins, or statues, were left at these intersections to ask for protection or favor during travel. Hermes, the square stone pillars with a head and a prominent phallus, were used as boundary markers, placed along roads and in front of homes. These were not designed to be beautiful but functional. They symbolized Hermes' watchful gaze at places of transition. Markets and ports invoked Hermes as their protector, not just for the trade itself, but for the deals, the bargains, the unspoken contracts that needed divine oversight. This made Hermes one of the few gods who was both celestial and earthly. He interacted with mortals daily, not through miracles but through the subtleties of travel, commerce, and communication. The messenger role, less glamour, more grit. Being a messenger sounds thrilling. Flying through the skies, bearing secrets from Olympus, delivering pronouncements. But the truth is a bit more mundane, and that's exactly what makes it interesting. Hermes' job was not simply to shout divine will from mountaintops. He often had to translate Zeus's commands, persuade reluctant humans or gods to act, and even escort those who did not wish to go where they were ordered. Take, for example, the story of Persephone. When Hades abducted her to the underworld, it was Hermes who was dispatched by Zeus to retrieve her. This was not a warlike mission, it was diplomatic, awkward, and ultimately unresolved. Persephone returned, but only partially. Hermes' task wasn't to undo a crime, it was to find an arrangement. In a world of rigid hierarchies, Hermes' flexibility was rare. His success was not in commanding, but in facilitating. His victories came from movement, not conquest. Apollo and Hermes, not just rivals. The early theft might suggest lifelong antagonism between the two gods, but the opposite is true. Hermes and Apollo became deeply intertwined, their roles balancing one another. Apollo represented clarity, truth, and light. Hermes represented ambiguity, negotiation, and shade. Their domains overlapped in music, prophecy, and communication, but rather than compete, they coexisted. In later stories, Hermes even borrowed Apollo's powers, acting as a prophet at Mount Cyllene, offering cryptic wisdom to those seeking it. Apollo, in turn, used Hermes' inventions and services freely. This kind of mutual respect is unusual in mythology, where rivalries often end in curses or catastrophes. Hermes and Apollo modeled something different: collaborative divinity, where skill sets are shared and misdeeds forgiven. From trickster to trusted. By the end of the cattle story, Hermes was no longer a mischievous baby. He was a god with a domain, a set of tools, and responsibilities that extended into both mortal and divine realms. He was entrusted with messages from Zeus, not simply repeating them, but delivering them with the nuance they required. Souls of the Dead, a quiet, shadowy task that involved compassion, not glory. Trade and merchants, a job that demanded attention to detail, contracts, and fairness. Thieves and tricksters, a reflection of his own beginnings, perhaps, but also a sign that cleverness had a place in the order of things. This transformation didn't happen with a dramatic battle or a fiery confrontation. It happened through quiet competence, charm, and well-timed gifts. It happened through Hermes' ability to exist in the in-between. So now we are left with a more mature Hermes, still young but established. He has earned the respect of his peers, not through strength but through smarts. But a question remains. What happens when the god of thieves becomes the escort of souls? How does one move from mischief to mortality? And what does it mean to walk others into the darkness? By now, Hermes had already surprised the gods. In a single day, he had gone from newborn to cattle thief, from thief to musician, and from musician to diplomat. He had used wit in place of might, and instead of being punished for his mischief, he had been entrusted with sacred roles. But of all his divine tasks, one stood out as the quietest and perhaps the heaviest. It was a role few wanted and fewer discussed. Hermes became the psychopompos, the guide of souls to the underworld. This task would not involve thunderbolts or lyres. No temples were built to glorify this aspect of his work. It involved silence, patience, and movement, not through the skies or across seas, but through the veil that separates the living from the dead. This is the story of Hermes, not as a thief or a diplomat, but as a companion in our final crossing. The meaning of psychopompos. The Greek word psychopompos, psi-upsilon chi-omicron pi-omicron mu pi-omicron sigma, comes from psyche, soul, and pompos, guide or conductor. It refers to someone divine or otherwise who escorts souls from the world of the living to the world of the dead. Hermes was not the judge of the dead. That was Hades. He was not the punisher that fell to the Furies, nor was he the comforter like Persephone in her springtime form. He was the one who walked beside you. In many vase paintings and reliefs, Hermes is shown standing quietly near dying mortals, not touching them, not intervening, just present, waiting. There is a particular loneliness in death, the ancients believed, and Hermes' role was to reduce that solitude to ensure that even in death, no soul walked alone. The underworld logistics. In the complex geography of Greek cosmology, the underworld was not a straightforward destination. It required navigation. First came death, often carried out by Thanatos, a lesser death god or spirit. Then the soul wandered confused, perhaps frightened toward the underworld's edges. There Hermes would appear, calm, ready, without judgment. He would lead the soul to Charon, the ferryman. With a coin, the obol, placed under the tongue or on the eyes of the deceased, Charon would ferry them across the river Styx. Beyond the river lay judgment, the fields of Asphodel, the Elysian fields, or less commonly the pit of Tartarus. Hermes did not participate in these fates. He was not a moral arbiter. He did not plead for or against a soul. He ensured passage. In a system so focused on ritual and order, his presence was essential. Without Hermes, the soul might be lost, wandering, trapped in the upper world, denied rest. Rituals of the dead, calling Hermes. Ancient Greeks, especially in later centuries, began invoking Hermes in their funeral rites. Libations were poured, offerings were made, not in temples but graveside. The appeal was simple. Guide them well. Hermes' image appears on funerary stelae not with wings and laughter but with calm solemnity. He sometimes holds the caduceus. He often lowers his gaze. In these images, we see a god who is not flashy or forceful. Instead, we see something more meaningful, a presence. and that presence was considered crucial. A god who crosses all borders. It is no coincidence that Hermes, the god of boundaries, was tasked with the ultimate boundary, life and death. He moved between Olympus and earth. He moved between cities and wilderness. He moved between gods and mortals. And he moved between mortality and eternity. This role made him deeply trusted, not for his power but for his reliability. Even in death, Hermes would arrive. He would appear when all other gods seemed distant. Unlike other gods, Hermes' appearances were not rare miracles, but expected. Comfort in transition. There is a peculiar sense of comfort in Hermes' psychopompic role. The Greeks didn't have a neat, sanitized view of death. They believed it was confusing, painful, and often unjust, but Hermes gave it order. Imagine the last breath drawn, confusion, perhaps fear, and then a soft rustle, a shadow with wings on its heels, a calm face not smiling but not cold, and a voice that says, "Come now, I know the way." It is not flashy, but it is dignified, and for many, this quiet dignity mattered far more than glory. Hermes and the mortal mind. As time went on, philosophers began to see Hermes not just as a literal escort of souls, but as a symbol of transition in thought. In later Hellenistic traditions, especially in Hermetic philosophy, he became a guide of inner journeys between ignorance and knowledge, between the mundane and the transcendent. But even in these evolved forms, his core identity held. He does not dominate the space, he moves through it. This quality would make Hermes uniquely adaptable over time, slipping into Roman myth as Mercury, re-emerging in Renaissance thought as Hermes Trismegistus, and even appearing in modern symbols of medicine, travel, and messaging. But it all started with one soft step through a cave, with stolen cattle, and a lyre fashioned from a tortoise shell. The full arc. Let us briefly recall how far Hermes has come in a single mythic tale. Birth in a remote cave, outside the order of Olympus. Invention of music before learning to speak. Theft of cattle as a challenge to hierarchy. Negotiation with a powerful brother and king. Acceptance into divine offices not through force, but through skill. Service not in thunder or spectacle, but in movement, mediation, and silent care. In the end, Hermes became something rare in the Greek pantheon, a god who was present in ordinary transitions. Not just when a soul crossed the Styx, but when a merchant crossed a border, when a traveler stepped into the unknown, when a decision, difficult and quiet, needed to be made. Final reflection: the unexpected holiness of movement. Greek mythology is filled with great battles, tragic deaths, grand punishments, and cosmic revenge. But Hermes stands apart. His story, beginning with stolen cattle, teaches us something quieter. That motion itself can be sacred. That cunning need not lead to cruelty. That transition, though unglamorous, is divine. And that even in the dullest border crossings of life, between roads, between choices, between breaths, someone is walking beside you. Story 2. Winged sandals and walking miles. Logistics in Olympus. When you imagine Mount Olympus, you may see palaces of marble suspended in clouds, glimmering halls of golden light, or gods lounging on divans while ambrosia flows like spring water. But such images, though vivid, are modern inventions. The ancient Greeks had a more nuanced, grounded understanding of Olympus. It was not a floating palace in the sky, but a real mountain. And even divine affairs, it turns out, required logistics. This is the story of Olympus not as a fantasy realm, but as a functioning society, one with meetings, messages, meals, miscommunications, and the constant need for one god to walk, fly, or glide from one end of Greece to another. That god, of course, was Hermes. But to understand why his winged sandals were not just a symbol, but a necessity, we must explore how Olympus really worked. Mount Olympus, a real mountain, not a cloud. Mount Olympus is a physical place. The tallest mountain in Greece, it rises more than 2,900 meters into the Thessalian sky. It's prone to sudden storms, rugged trails, and shifting light. For ancient Greeks, it was both mythical and tangible. They did not climb it casually. The summit, shrouded in clouds, was mysterious, yes, but not unreachable. To live atop it, even metaphorically, implied a kind of stillness and permanence. But that stillness only extended to the thrones of the gods. Their influence, like their messengers, moved constantly. There were sacrifices to attend, oracles to oversee, temples to inspect. Mortals expected appearances, signs, answers, and Olympus, despite its grandeur, did not run itself. Which brings us to a practical question. How did the gods get things done? Olympus as a bureaucracy. Imagine Olympus not as a divine amusement park but as a small, overburdened court. Zeus, as king, received petitions. Hera managed familial disputes. Athena oversaw laws and strategies. Apollo ran a prophetic service. Demeter governed agricultural cycles. And Hermes handled everything that moved. In myths, he is rarely sitting. He is always en route to deliver a message, guide a soul, check on a trade route, or settle a minor squabble between humans who have no idea their prayers are clogging the divine inbox. Olympus had rules to enforce, temples to coordinate, sacrifices to receive, oracles to confirm, gossip to manage. Hermes' presence at all of these was less glamorous than functional. He wasn't the star of the show, he was the courier, the scheduler, the divine postal service. Without him, everything slowed down. The sandals that carried a system. The talaria, or winged sandals, are among Hermes' most iconic attributes, but the myth doesn't dwell on their comfort or design. What matters is what they enabled: mobility. They were not flashy. They didn't leave streaks in the sky or thunder in the clouds. Instead, they symbolized speed, adaptability, and reliability. In a time before roads were paved or carriages rolled, speed meant endurance. Hermes had to cross mountains, forests, seas, and deserts not just once but repeatedly. The talaria made this possible. But they were not magic in the way later stories suggest. They did not teleport Hermes. They allowed flight, yes, but he still had to know where to go, what to say, and how to navigate human geography, not just topography. Hermes was not just fast, he was informed. Divine deliveries, not as easy as it sounds. Consider some of Hermes' most recurring tasks. Delivering Zeus's edicts. These were not always welcome messages. In some cases, they involved life-changing orders. Imagine telling a mortal king that his daughter was to be taken by the gods, or informing a god that they were to leave a lover alone. Diplomacy was key. Responding to offerings. When mortals prayed or sacrificed, someone had to carry the message. Not all gods received them directly. Hermes sometimes acted as an intermediary, interpreting vague prayers or returning answers in signs. Settling disputes. As the only god trusted by thieves and kings alike, Hermes often acted as a neutral party, particularly when conflict arose at crossroads, borders, or between traveling groups. Updating Olympus. Even the gods, it turns out, could be out of the loop. Hermes often had to bring news from one domain to another: Artemis from the forests, Poseidon from the seas, Hades from below. Without him, the pantheon was fragmented. These weren't dramatic stories, they weren't epic poems, but they were essential. The problem of distance in the ancient world. Today, we underestimate distance. We flatten it into pixels and lines on a map. But in the ancient world, distance was physical, dangerous, and slow. Greece is a land of mountains and islands, not open plains. Travel was limited by terrain and weather. Even between city-states, movement was constrained. Now imagine Olympus as a central hub and the gods as functionaries managing different regions. Hermes became not just a messenger but a supply chain. Without him, things did not arrive. News did not travel. Responses were not delivered. In this way, Hermes was less like a magical being and more like a courier caught in divine logistics. Symbolism in the sandals. Over time, the talaria took on layered meanings. They were no longer just tools, but symbols of efficiency. Speed without recklessness. Movement with purpose. Access across boundaries. Artists and poets reference the talaria not because they sparkled, but because they allowed access. Hermes could go where others could not. From Olympus to Earth. From Earth to the underworld. From mortals to immortals. From silence to speech. He was the god of the in-between, and his sandals were the simple tools that enabled it. The forgotten roots. What we rarely hear in myth are the routes Hermes took, the cities visited, the obscure temples, the market squares, the dusty hillsides where no glory waited, only routine. Imagine a week in Hermes' life. Monday, Athens carry a ruling from Zeus to the Areopagus. Tuesday, Delphi check the oracle's clarity. Apollo has complaints. Wednesday, Crete escort a soul from Knossos. Thursday, Troy negotiate an exchange between gods over a misunderstanding. Friday, Euboea remind local merchants of the proper sacrifice procedure. Saturday, back to Olympus for a review. Sunday, no rest Zeus has a surprise assignment. These were not adventures, they were tasks, and in completing them Hermes became something rare, a god who worked. Hermes' sandals were not just wings on his heels. They were the embodiment of a role that no other Olympian embraced, a role of motion, of presence, of invisible labor. And that raises a quiet but important question. What does it mean that the most reliable god of Olympus was also the most overlooked, always arriving, always leaving, but never staying long enough to be praised? We peeled back the clouds from Mount Olympus to reveal a quieter truth, that even among gods, someone had to keep the system running. Hermes wasn't just the god of mischief and wit, he was the essential courier between divine offices, sacred places, and mortal cities. But Olympus, like any organization of power, depended not only on messages being sent, but also on them being understood, accepted, and remembered. We follow Hermes on the ground not in mythic adventures, but in his day-to-day circuits. We'll look at how gods interacted with cities, how temples expected responses from Olympus, and how Hermes became the bridge not only between places, but between beliefs, practices, and people. This is the story of how a divine network stayed connected without scrolls or scribes, and how one god walked it all, one border at a time. Divine networks, Olympus and the city-states. Ancient Greece was not a unified empire. It was a web of independent city-states, each with its own cults, customs, and calendar of festivals. Athens honored Athena above all. Sparta leaned toward Ares. Delphi belonged to Apollo. Eleusis revered Demeter. So when a decision was made on Olympus, say, a divine warning, a sacred decree, or an invitation to worship, who made sure the message arrived in the right dialect, with the right rituals to the right people? Hermes. He didn't invent the message. He didn't dictate the terms, but he ensured it traveled from divine will to human understanding. This was not a job of drama. It was one of repetition, patience, and cultural fluency. Consider the logistics. Festivals had to be coordinated. New temples had to be acknowledged. Prophecies needed cross-regional confirmation. Oracles required maintenance of divine reputation. These were not battlefield maneuvers or affairs of grand prophecy. They were matters of calendar, ceremony, and communication. And when mortals failed to perform the proper rites or misinterpreted a sign, Hermes was dispatched to smooth the consequences. A day in the life, the quiet roots. Picture Hermes descending from Olympus not in a blaze of glory, but with dust on his sandals and a schedule in his mind. To Corinth, to remind sailors that Poseidon's favor did not exempt them from paying tribute to Hermes before setting sail. To Thebes, to carry word that Dionysus's festival date was to be moved. To Argos, where a misunderstanding over a sacrifice to Hera needed neutral clarification. To the island of Delos, where a rare star alignment had caused a surge in offerings to Apollo, and now Apollo expected an accounting. These routes were not charted in epic poems. No Homeric bard sang of them, but they kept belief systems running. Without Hermes, these systems would fracture, not through violence, but through simple miscommunication, a missed festival, a forgotten offering, an unanswered prayer. Between borders, the god of thresholds. Greek religion placed enormous importance on boundaries, not just political ones, but personal, spiritual, and ritual boundaries. Thresholds mattered. Entering a home was sacred. Crossing into a new land required appeasement. Passing from one phase of life to another, childhood to adulthood, unmarried to married, life to death, demanded rituals. Hermes presided over all these transitions. At city gates, Hermes stood, stone pillars with his face and an erect phallus, symbolizing fertility, protection, and presence. These were not ornamental, they were markers of passage. When a traveler approached a city, they passed Hermes. When a merchant loaded a cart, they invoked Hermes. When a priest led a procession, Hermes was acknowledged at the start, not at the altar, but at the beginning of the road. This placement tells us something important. Hermes wasn't about the destination. He was about getting there. And in this way, he presided not over grand events, but over the quiet spaces between them. Diplomacy and mediation. Greek myths are filled with wars and grudges among the gods, but these conflicts rarely led to all-out celestial battles. More often, tensions were managed quietly, through negotiation and the occasional compromise. Hermes, as a neutral figure, often stepped in. When Aphrodite and Hera feuded over worship in a city, Hermes might deliver a split ruling from Zeus. When Apollo grew jealous of a seer praised in a temple he did not control, Hermes might suggest a joint shrine. When mortals tried to elevate a local hero to near-divine status, Hermes might be sent to remind them that such actions required divine approval. These tasks were not glamorous, but they were vital. Hermes did not wield power, he wielded trust. Gods listened to him not because he commanded them, but because he understood them. And mortals, they believed in his fairness. Between belief and practice. Religious belief in ancient Greece was not static. It varied between regions, evolved over centuries, and adapted to circumstances. A god in one city might be feared, in another celebrated, and in yet another barely acknowledged. This fluidity required constant adjustment. Hermes, as the god of adaptation, became the invisible thread that kept things coherent. He inspired scribes in temple to standardize rituals. He delivered omens to redirect worshippers when a ceremony went astray. He even quietly absorbed attributes from other gods when it suited the context, becoming a protector of flocks in rural areas, a god of eloquence in urban courts, a trickster among the disenfranchised. His malleability was not a weakness, it was a method of survival. Hermes existed wherever things were in flux. When the sandals wore thin. Even a god in mythic imagination has limits. There were moments in later stories where Hermes expressed weariness, not physical fatigue, but a kind of cosmic exhaustion from constantly being in transit, always between things, never fully belonging. In some Orphic traditions, Hermes is portrayed as restless, even sorrowful, not because he lacked power, but because he lacked place. He did not live on Olympus as Zeus did, nor reside in the sea like Poseidon, nor preside over fields like Demeter. He was not tied to one temple, one city, or even one realm. He was always on the way. And in that constant motion, there is a subtle loneliness, a condition many travelers, diplomats, or messengers across history have known. Legacy of the messenger. Centuries later, as Greek religion merged with Roman, and then with philosophical and mystical traditions, Hermes' image evolved again. He became Mercury, the Roman god of commerce, still with winged sandals. Hermes Trismegistus, a mystical philosopher in alchemical texts, a symbol of eloquence in Renaissance literature. The model for communication itself, his name, eventually invoked in the English word hermeneutics, the science of interpretation. But long before all that, he was simply a god walking a message from here to there. And so we return to our image. A dusty road, a small shrine by a tree, a figure in a short cloak adjusting his sandals, already listening for the next call. And we wonder, what kind of power does it take to always move, to never stay, to be known not for ruling, but for arriving and leaving, again and again? We walked beside Hermes across the dusty, sacred routes of ancient Greece. We saw how he carried not just messages, but systems, rituals, and cultural continuity. His winged sandals didn't just symbolize speed, they enabled the invisible function of Olympus itself. We will look at the outcomes of Hermes, endless motion, how he became the embodiment of infrastructure in a society with no central government, no post office, no roads connecting all its parts. Hermes didn't rule, he connected. And in doing so, he showed that sometimes the most powerful forces in history are those that go unnoticed, those that simply show up over and over again. Infrastructure without roads. In today's terms, we rely on highways, air traffic systems, and digital communication to keep civilization running. But in ancient Greece, none of this existed. There were trails, animal tracks, coastal sea routes, and occasionally cobbled roads built near important cities. But these were often inconsistent, seasonal, or dangerous. And yet, a merchant in Thebes might offer the same sacrifice to Hermes as a sailor in Chios or a shepherd in Thessaly. How? How did belief, ritual, and even expectation stay aligned in such a fragmented world? The answer again is Hermes. He wasn't just delivering scrolls. He was maintaining coherence between gods and mortals, between city-states and their shared mythology, between language, behavior, and worship. In this way, Hermes was the infrastructure of Olympus, not the columns or temples but the connective tissue, the everyday effort that made the divine relevant. Symbol of invisible labor. Hermes was never worshipped in grand festivals like Zeus or Apollo. He didn't have a mythic war or a monster to slay. His stories were smaller, quieter, and sometimes comic. And yet, this very lack of grandeur is what makes him so compelling. Because history, real history, is made more often by quiet function than by grand spectacle. In Hermes, we see the divine expression of invisible labor. He was the one who arranged for things to happen smoothly. He prevented conflict before it started. He explained before punishment was needed. He showed up when no one else wanted the job. And in this way, he became trusted, if not adored. Like many real-life figures who keep societies moving, translators, couriers, diplomats, coordinators, Hermes rarely took the spotlight. But when he did, he often gave it away, turning attention to others, resolving disputes, or making the system look seamless. The trust economy of the gods. One of the most understated facts of Greek religion is how much it relied on trust. There were no central religious texts, no binding laws across city-states. What unified the religion was ritual behavior, myths, and assumed reciprocity between gods and mortals. Hermes was at the center of that system of trust. He was trusted to deliver, trusted not to distort, trusted to appear, to interpret, to relay, and perhaps most importantly, trusted to be neutral. In a world of divine egos and human ambition, Hermes did not favor one side. His loyalty was to movement, to the act of transit, not the content of the message. He was the god of flow of traffic, of commerce, of diplomacy, and ultimately of functionality. Lessons in divine function. Let's step back from mythology and ask, what can we learn from a god like Hermes? The answer is simple, but often overlooked. Things don't work unless someone does the work. Hermes reminds us that behind every grand moment, every prophecy, every offering, every divine revelation is a chain of small actions, movements, and negotiations that made it possible. He tells us that speed isn't just about power, it's about timing. Communication isn't just about speaking, it's about being understood. Trust doesn't come from domination, it comes from reliability. And importance doesn't require visibility. Hermes made Olympus possible, not by commanding it but by carrying it. Hermes in the modern imagination. As we mentioned earlier, Hermes transformed over time. The Romans saw him as Mercury, patron of merchants, travelers, and messengers. Later, in medieval texts, Hermes morphed again, this time into Hermes Trismegistus, a philosophical figure said to have written esoteric wisdom that blended Greek, Egyptian, and mystical traditions. In all these forms, he retained the same qualities: fluidity, movement, connection, transition. Even today, symbols associated with Hermes persist. The caduceus, though often confused with the rod of Asclepius, still represents commerce, negotiation, and even medical systems where communication between practitioners, patients, and systems is key. In digital communication, we speak of Hermes protocols or message brokers. In psychology, we explore Hermetic principles to understand the unseen workings of the mind. Each of these, though abstract, follows the same logic. Without someone to move the message, nothing changes. A final image. Picture Hermes not in flight but walking. His sandals are dusty, his eyes scan the horizon. Ahead lies a port town where the rituals have grown slack. A storm is gathering over the sea. The sailors are worried, but they haven't made their proper offering. He will not punish them. That is not his way. He will arrive, speak gently, and remind them. And then he will leave, unseen by most, remembered by few. But the offering will be made, the ship will sail, the city will prosper. And Hermes, again, will not stay to be thanked. So the next time you hear a message arrive, or travel a familiar path, or negotiate a quiet understanding between two people, consider the possibility that Hermes is still with us. Not shouting, not dazzling, but walking beside the world, ensuring things keep moving. And we are left with this final question. If the gods needed Hermes to function, who in our world are the invisible people we depend on, but so rarely see? Story 3. The first postal route: how Hermes delivered Zeus's messages. The image of Zeus is iconic. He is the bearded king of Olympus, a figure of supreme authority standing amidst clouds with a thunderbolt in hand. When he speaks, the skies rumble. When he commands, nature bends to his will. But authority, no matter how divine, still requires one very human thing: communication. In the ancient world, power did not mean omnipresence. Even Zeus, ruler of Olympus, could not be in all places at once. His edicts had to travel. His words needed context. His intentions needed tone. And thunder, while dramatic, often lacked precision. Thus entered Hermes, not as a sidekick, but as a system. This is the story of how a god known for stealing cattle and inventing the lyre became the architect of the first celestial communication network, a divine postal route, complete with protocols, destinations, and unspoken rules. We begin not with a scroll or a flash of light, but with a message that needed to get somewhere. The problem of divine distance. We tend to imagine gods as omniscient, all-seeing, present in every corner of the world. But the Greek gods were not that. They were powerful, yes, but their influence was localized. They resided in temples, appeared in dreams, sent signs through nature, but they required mechanisms to extend their will. Consider the geography. Greece was a collection of islands, mountains, scattered polis. There were no broadcast systems, no centralized religion. So how did Zeus, with his hundreds of cults, oracles, temples, and worshippers, maintain unity? Not with lightning, with messages. And for those messages to be heard, someone had to carry them. The role of Hermes, beyond running. Hermes was not simply a divine runner. He was, in effect, Zeus's chief of staff. He received orders, interpreted them, and delivered them with context. Often, he softened Zeus's tone, tailored the message to the audience, or adapted it to regional norms. For example, when Zeus decreed that mortals must limit their sacrifices to avoid overharvesting, Hermes delivered the message in agricultural metaphors to farmers. When cities defied Zeus by building temples to mortal kings, Hermes didn't just scold them, he appeared in dreams to warn their priests, subtly nudging the culture back into line. When a mortal queen begged for fertility, and Zeus approved it, Hermes might deliver the blessing not directly, but by whispering into the ear of a local midwife. These were not grand performances. They were quiet, administrative miracles. The first routes. Unlike human couriers who needed roads, Hermes had no such constraints, yet he still established routes not marked on land but known in practice. These were the celestial route between Olympus and other divine realms, Poseidon's palace beneath the sea, Hades' halls in the underworld, and the floating isles of divine retreat. The oracle route connecting Zeus to the various centers of prophecy, Delphi, Dodona, and later Claros. These places required frequent updates, clarifications, and on rare occasions censorship. The mortal affairs route to cities, palaces, fields, and battlefronts, where Hermes delivered signs, dreams, and even direct appearances. The ritual feedback loop, a less talked about route, through which Hermes brought mortal prayers, offerings, and complaints back to Zeus, who could then adjust policy, punishment, or reward. In short, Hermes made sure that communication was two-way. Even the king of gods needed feedback. Dream deliveries, the original inbox. Among Hermes' more subtle delivery mechanisms were dreams. He, along with Morpheus and the Oneiroi dream spirits, crafted messages to appear while mortals slept. These weren't abstract or surreal, they were structured, informative dreams, used to warn kings of incoming plagues, announce divine favor or disapproval, predict safe times to travel or plant, pass messages between gods and mortals when appearing in person was inconvenient. Hermes did not invent dreams, but he optimized them. His presence gave dreams clarity, urgency, and meaning. Ancient dream interpreters often invoked Hermes before analyzing a vision. Think of it as the earliest form of secure communication, private, symbolic, and deeply personal. The question of authority. What gave Hermes the right to speak for Zeus? Not divine birth alone. Plenty of gods were children of Zeus, but few had access to his plans. Hermes earned his role not through lineage but through reliability. He delivered quickly, clearly, and discreetly. Diplomacy. He could tailor the tone of a message without distorting it. Discretion. Hermes was trusted with secrets including punishments, blessings, and covert assignments. Mediation. He could diffuse tensions when messages caused offense. In this way, Hermes was not just a courier, he was an editor, a negotiator, and at times a spy. Messages of power, not just words. Messages in the ancient world were not always verbal. In many cases, signs were used: a bird flying west, a sudden storm, a statue weeping. Hermes had a hand in this too. Through these signs, he delivered what could not be said aloud. He was responsible for symbols and omens that reinforced divine will. body language in divine dreams. Physical interventions, like turning a person around at a forked road or sending a stranger with a warning. Because in Greek thought, how a message arrived mattered just as much as what it said. And Hermes, ever the choreographer, made sure the message matched the moment. Not all messages were welcome. Sometimes Hermes had to deliver bad news. A favorite mortal had drawn divine wrath. A city's hubris had reached its limit. A king's sacrifice had been rejected. In these cases, Hermes appeared not as a smiling figure but as a stern messenger, cloaked, silent, letting the message weigh on the air. His presence was not always comforting. It was a sign that something was about to change, whether mortals liked it or not. And yet even then Hermes showed a kind of mercy. He rarely punished. He rarely threatened. He simply informed and let events unfold. Communication before writing. Perhaps the most astonishing thing about Hermes' function is that it predated widespread literacy. In Homer's world, writing existed but was rare. Oral culture dominated. So the idea of a written letter, scroll, or permanent decree was not the norm. Hermes was the spoken word, carried with precision. In this way, he mirrors traditions from across ancient civilizations. The Sumerian messenger gods, who carried fate between deities. The Egyptian Thoth, a scribe god of measured speech. The Roman Mercury, who inherited Hermes' wings but adapted to a literate empire. All of them suggest the same truth: speech mattered, delivery mattered, clarity mattered. Hermes embodied all three. So now, as we picture him, sandal wings fluttering softly, staff in hand, a message forming on his lips, we must ask, what happens when the messenger understands the message better than the one who sent it? We uncovered the functional side of Olympus, how Hermes transformed divine will into understandable instruction, how he devised routes across realms, and how the god of movement maintained the unspoken infrastructure of the ancient Greek world. But the act of delivering messages was only part of the work. We examine what it meant for Hermes to communicate, not simply to bring a message from point A to point B, but to ensure that the meaning, intention, and impact arrived intact. Because in a culture without email, scroll archives, or voice recordings, a god's message lived or died by its delivery. We'll explore how Hermes became a master of interpretation, how mortals tried to decode his signs, and how the burden of delivering the will of Zeus meant dealing not just with speed, but with semantics. Divine speech, not meant for mortal ears. Zeus, for all his authority, did not always speak plainly. His decrees could be obscure, his visions dramatic, and his interventions cryptic. Lightning bolts don't come with captions. Hermes became the filter translating cosmic will into usable knowledge. If Zeus declared that a plague would fall upon a city, Hermes would ensure the reason was clear. If Zeus sent a storm to halt a fleet, Hermes might visit a general in a dream, explaining the cause. If a king's offering displeased Olympus, Hermes would appear at the altar not to punish, but to correct. In doing this, Hermes became the most understood of the gods, not because he was simple, but because he made others less confusing. He was not the author of the law, but its interpreter. In modern terms, Hermes would be a constitutional scholar, a speechwriter, and a diplomatic envoy rolled into one. Sacred ambiguity, the risk of misinterpretation. But even Hermes, swift and articulate, could not always control how his messages were received. Greek religion was full of ambiguity. Omens were subtle, dreams were layered, prophecies could be misunderstood. Hermes could deliver the message perfectly, but interpretation was still in the hands of mortals. A few famous examples highlight this. Croesus, king of Lydia, misinterpreted a prophecy that a great empire would fall if he went to war. He assumed it referred to his enemies. He lost. Agamemnon, reading signs from the gods through omens and auguries, made fateful decisions that led to the Trojan War, all based on signs that Hermes may have helped send. Farmers who saw an eclipse might believe Hermes warned of famine, even if the message was about taxes. This ambiguity wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. Hermes delivered messages in alignment with context. The gods didn't want robots. They wanted humans who had to choose, reflect, and sometimes err. And Hermes, ever impartial, delivered the signs without judgment. The protocols of delivery. Over time, mortals began to recognize patterns in Hermes' messages. Just as couriers today have expected routes, timeframes, and delivery etiquette, Hermes had his divine protocols. Here are a few recognized forms. Dream visitation, often accompanied by a strong sense of lucidity. Hermes would appear clothed plainly, sometimes hooded, often saying little but implying much. The stranger at the gate. In some stories, Hermes takes the form of a beggar or traveler, delivering advice in disguise. Those who ignore him suffer quiet misfortunes. The sudden wind. A sharp breeze during a sacrifice or prayer could signal Hermes. Attention, a sign to listen more closely to your surroundings. Lost and found objects. It was believed that small items that disappeared and reappeared were moved by Hermes, either as a joke or a subtle message. Coin and commerce omens. A sudden fall in profits or a miscounted trade could be taken as a sign that offerings had been forgotten. Each of these delivery methods became part of a ritual language, a kind of sacred semiotics that Hermes orchestrated but never fully controlled. The divine editor, adjusting for the audience. Hermes' gift was not just in speed, but in tailoring the message. Like a good ambassador, he could take a raw, blunt directive from Zeus and refine it into something digestible. Take the example of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods. Zeus was furious. The original punishment was destruction, but Hermes, knowing the broader implications, intervened subtly. While the final punishment, eternal liver-eating, was harsh, Hermes shaped the delivery in such a way that the story became a lesson, not just a sentence. Similarly, when Persephone was taken by Hades, Hermes was sent to retrieve her. But he didn't start with orders. He negotiated, balanced the interests of Demeter, Hades, and Zeus, and returned with compromise. The pomegranate seeds became the symbol of seasonal death, not total loss. In this way, Hermes shaped the interpretation of divine events not by altering them, but by guiding their understanding. Message fatigue, when the gods didn't listen. Despite his clarity, Hermes sometimes found that gods were worse listeners than mortals. Ares ignored his summons to attend a tribunal and had to be embarrassed into appearing. Aphrodite, receiving warnings through Hermes about excessive favoritism, dismissed them and sowed divine jealousy in return. Hades, notoriously resistant to outside input, often let Hermes speak only in the presence of Persephone, who softened his judgments. These episodes reveal an ironic truth. Hermes was most effective among humans, where listening mattered. The gods, in contrast, were often too confident to hear correction. Thus, the god of speech often found his words most powerful in the mortal realm. Temples and shrines, the postal hubs of the ancient world. Across the Greek world, shrines to Hermes served as communication points. They were not large like the Parthenon or the Temple of Apollo, but they were frequent. They stood at road crossings, city gates, marketplace corners, ports and harbors. These shrines were stocked with small offerings, oil, cakes, coins left in exchange for safe passage and favorable delivery. Merchants would ask for a successful deal. Travelers would pray for good weather. Runners would leave tokens for speed. In a way, Hermes had created the first postal drop boxes, distributed across geography and bound by ritual. Through these simple structures, his network extended. The message as miracle. There's a kind of miracle in a message arriving exactly when it's needed. In Greek myth, this is Hermes, greatest power not to change the world, but to time the information that changes someone's mind. A king about to make war receives a dream and delays. A merchant doubting his deal finds a coin on the road. A traveler uncertain of a fork follows a breeze and arrives safely. None of these are dramatic events, they are quiet turns in the road. But they often change everything. So now, as we imagine Hermes not in flight but mid-conversation, not issuing orders, but offering gentle correction, we are left to wonder. If Hermes was the god of communication, what does it mean that his greatest skill was not speaking but listening? We witnessed how Hermes was not just a messenger, but an interpreter and editor, and at times, the only god actually paying attention. He brought clarity to chaos, discretion to divine wrath, and context to the cryptic. But delivering Zeus's messages wasn't just a sacred job, it became a model for civilization. We'll explore how Hermes, divine communication methods formed the foundation of human networks, from ancient mail routes and legal systems to oratory, diplomacy, and the subtle rituals of everyday communication. What began as myth ended as infrastructure, cultural, spiritual, and political. This is the story of how one god's sandals walked so many miles that eventually humans took over the route. Human imitation, from gods to couriers. The ancient Greeks didn't only worship Hermes, they imitated him. His role as the divine communicator deeply influenced the development of human communication systems, particularly among the city-states that needed reliable ways to transmit messages across dangerous, rugged terrain. Some examples: heralds, couriers. These were the human equivalents of Hermes' official messengers who traveled between cities bearing proclamations, peace treaties, or declarations of war. They carried staffs modeled after Hermes' caduceus and were often considered untouchable during conflict. Envoys and diplomats. Many diplomatic customs were traced to Hermes' impartiality and eloquence. A good envoy wasn't the loudest, but the one who could cross boundaries and return unscathed. Marathon runners and messengers. Long-distance runners were honored not just for their speed but for their hermetic virtue, endurance, accuracy, and neutrality. These roles were sacred not for their excitement, but for their reliability. And that's a Hermes legacy: invisibility with impact. Written messages, Hermes and the birth of the letter. As writing evolved, so too did the symbolic role of Hermes. Scrolls bore the name of Hermes as their guardian. Letters began with invocations like, "Hermes, guide this message." In magical papyri, spells invoking clarity, influence, or speed often named him. The first written laws, too, were dedicated to him not because he wrote them, but because he could carry and interpret them. Even as scribes emerged and postal systems grew, Hermes remained present, invoked whenever clarity, speed, or discretion were required. We might even say that Hermes wasn't replaced by the postman, he was hiding inside him. From communication to commerce, there's a reason why Hermes is also the god of trade. What is trade if not a form of messaging? Goods are exchanged with agreed meaning. Prices represent value, just as words represent ideas. Markets rely on trust, speed, and neutral delivery. Hermes became the patron of merchants, not because he loved money, but because he loved movement. Trade was just another form of message, and a well-made deal was a kind of conversation. In marketplaces, travelers built shrines to Hermes not to protect their coin purses, but to ensure that communication across culture and language would not break down. Even today, many languages have idioms that tie speech and value together. Make your case. Strike a deal. Word is bond. Each of these, in its own way, is hermetic. Hermes in the courtroom and the classroom. As oral culture evolved into rhetoric, Hermes shifted again. No longer just the god of messages, he became the god of speaking well. Orators asked for his favor before trials. Teachers invoked him to bless eloquence. Poets saw him as a helper, helping words flow like rivers, not get tangled in thickets. To speak clearly, truthfully, and persuasively, that was Hermetic. But there's an important caveat. Hermes also protected deception. Not malicious lies, but cunning rhetoric, the ability to obscure as well as reveal. In this way, he was both the ideal teacher and the trickiest student. He reminds us, words can liberate and manipulate, and the one who delivers the message has power over how it is received. The modern legacy, Mercury rising. The Romans called him Mercury, and in doing so, widened his influence even further. Mercury was no longer just a god of messages, he was a planet, a chemical element, a symbol of change, mobility, and adaptability. In alchemy, mercury was a primary substance fluid, elusive, transformative. In medicine, the caduceus Hermes staff was adopted, confusingly, as a medical symbol, a reminder that clear messaging could heal. In commerce, the winged helmet and sandals became emblems of speed and trust. Everywhere we look in modern culture, logistics, medicine, communication, business, Hermes lingers. He may not be named, but his blueprint is there. From myth to method, let's revisit what Hermes built. A system for delivering divine messages to a complex, disjointed world. A culture of interpretation that emphasized not just clarity, but context. A model of trustworthiness that outlived the stories. And most impressively, a belief that messages matter, even when the sender is far away. This wasn't just religion, it was a method. Today, when we open an email, give a speech, sign a contract, or whisper a warning, we are participating in Hermes' legacy. We are still building routes, crafting messages, and praying silently or otherwise that they will arrive as intended. Final thought, the message arrives. So picture Hermes one last time. Not flying but walking. Not laughing but listening. Not interrupting, but waiting for the moment the message will matter. He does not write the law. He does not sit on the throne. He only brings the words. But in the right moment, at the right fork in the road, his message changes everything. And so we end this story with a final reflection. In a noisy world, filled with messages, how many of us are still listening for the one that comes not loudly, but on winged sandals? Story 4. A god among merchants, trade, thieves, and the quiet rise of commerce. In our previous stories, we've followed Hermes as a child thief, a winged courier, and a divine interpreter. But to the ancient Greeks, especially the ones who dealt in coin, cargo, and contracts, Hermes was not just a messenger. He was the god of commerce. And in that role, he presided over a quiet but profound force, the daily negotiation of value. This is the story of Hermes not on Olympus or at the crossroads of myth, but among the stalls of the marketplace, the backs of caravans, and the minds of those who spent their days weighing olives, counting coinage, and managing risk. Commerce, like Hermes himself, rarely stood still. It didn't make proclamations or demand temples the size of Zeus, but it moved things. It fed cities. It linked islands. It made the world slowly, steadily more connected. And at the heart of this movement, walking quietly between buyer and seller, honest man and trickster, stood Hermes. Agora, the heartbeat of ancient cities. Every major Greek city had an agora, an open, public marketplace where trade and civic life met. It was not just a place to buy goods. It was where people voted, debated, heard proclamations, made offerings, hired labor, gossiped, and crucially, exchanged goods and services. To walk through an agora was to walk through the economic nervous system of a city-state. And in nearly every one of these spaces, a small shrine to Hermes stood at the entrance, at the edge, or near the coin scales. He was not there for ceremony. He was there because commerce needed trust, and trust needed a god. Commerce as conversation. In ancient Greece, buying and selling was more like conversation than transaction. There were no barcodes, prices were not fixed, haggling was expected, payment was sometimes deferred, and the value of a product often depended on the seller's tone, the buyer's demeanor, the timing of the purchase, local events or omens. All of these are hermetic variables, fleeting, interpretable, and rooted in negotiation. Hermes, god of speech, persuasion, and adaptability, was the ideal overseer for this system. He did not demand fairness, he expected skill. He did not enforce laws, he encouraged cleverness. In this way, Hermes was not just a god of trade, he was a god of soft power. The merchant's patron. For traders, especially those traveling by sea or land, Hermes was not optional, he was essential. Before departure, merchants would make small offerings at roadside Hermes or at harbor altars. During a voyage, they might toss a coin or bread into the waves in his name. Upon safe return, they were expected to give thanks, often with a small portion of profit. What did Hermes offer in return? Safe passage through foreign ports, luck in negotiation, protection against theft or success in committing it, a watchful eye on contracts and measures. Unlike Zeus, who ruled from afar, Hermes walked the docks, listened to deals, and winked at clever bartering. Trade and trickery, the dual nature. Hermes is unique among gods in that he's associated with both commerce and theft. To the modern mind, this may seem contradictory, but to the Greeks, it was simply honest. All trade involves persuasion. All persuasion involves a degree of performance. And in performance, there is always the possibility of deceit. Hermes didn't punish dishonesty. He rewarded wit. A merchant who could disguise poor goods behind poetic praise, or a buyer who could talk down a price through flattery, these were acts of hermetic brilliance. In some cases, thieves offered to Hermes not as penitents, but as professionals acknowledging that their craft was dangerous, daring, and dependent on timing. He was, in this sense, the god of risk management, and commerce, like thievery, is nothing if not risk. Weights, measures, and the illusion of fairness. Markets had systems to standardize trade, official weights, regulated scales, coinage marks, but enforcement varied. And even in the best of times, sellers could tamper, customers could scheme, and middlemen could mislead. Hermes' role was not to eliminate fraud, it was to balance it. If a buyer was naive, Hermes might let them be cheated once so they'd learn. If a seller was greedy, Hermes might arrange a sudden loss in another deal. If a traveler paid respect at every shrine, Hermes might nudge fortune their way with a lucky wind. He was a moral accountant, but his ledger valued cleverness over purity. From local market to maritime network. As Greek colonies spread across the Mediterranean to Sicily, to Asia Minor, to North Africa, trade expanded. Goods flowed between cultures: wine, oil, ceramics, grain, textiles, slaves. And with this growing network came greater risk. Pirates, currency confusion, weather unpredictability, cultural misunderstandings. Hermes' influence scaled with these roots. New shrines popped up at foreign ports. Greek traders taught locals about the god of safe passage. Even non-Greeks came to leave tokens at hermetic altars, hoping for fair winds or successful exchanges. In this way, Hermes became not just a Greek god, but a pan-Mediterranean symbol of movement and negotiation. The quiet power of money. Perhaps most intriguing is how Hermes oversaw not just the act of trade, but the idea of money itself. Coinage in Greece began around the 7th century BCE. It changed everything. Barter became unnecessary. Standardized value emerged. Wealth could be stored, moved, hidden, taxed. Hermes, god of portability and conversion, was perfectly suited to this shift. He wasn't a god of wealth like Plutus. He was the god of what wealth allowed: mobility, possibility, exchange. Money, after all, is a message, a statement of value, trust, and future potential. And who better to deliver that message than the god of words? So we arrive at a marketplace at dusk, the stalls mostly quiet. A merchant counts coins. A boy sweeps up discarded olive pits. A traveler argues gently with a seller over the price of wool. And near the gate, unnoticed by most, stands a weathered Hermes, a reminder that even here, among beans and bronze, a god is watching. But we are left to wonder. In a world where value is always shifting, and truth often depends on tone, can fairness ever be more than a well-told story? We explored Hermes in the marketplace not just as the patron of merchants and thieves, but as a divine presence hovering over every transaction, from honest trades to cunning bargains. In this second section, we follow Hermes deeper into the logic of commerce, the contracts, coinage, customs, and quiet compromises that turned local exchanges into vast, interlinked economies. Trade was not merely movement of goods, it was the movement of trust, expectation, and cultural norms. Hermes didn't just protect trade, he shaped it. Let's now enter the realm of commerce as culture, a network of rules, rituals, and risks, where Hermes presided not as a judge, but as a god of calculated ambiguity. The contract, an ancient act of faith. Before contracts were written on wax tablets, they were made aloud, a spoken agreement, sealed with a gesture, a token, or the presence of witnesses. These agreements could be as simple as, "You will bring me 20 amphorae of olive oil before the next full moon, and I will pay you with 1 pig." Or as complicated as, "You will transport cargo to Chios, retain 15% of any profit, and pay my cousin in kind upon return." These promises were fragile, especially in a world where paper was rare, travel was slow, and trust could be betrayed. That's why merchants invoked Hermes. They poured libations before speaking the terms. They left offerings at Hermes near city gates or ports. They called upon his name to witness the agreement as a neutral observer. In many ways, Hermes was the enforcer of reputation. He didn't punish with lightning or curses, but if a merchant broke a sacred contract, rumors might spread, customers might disappear, a ship might fail to arrive, coin might fall just short of what was counted. Coincidence or hermetic correction? Coinage, a message cast in metal. Coins introduced in Lydia and widely adopted in Greece were more than convenience. They were miniature messages. On each one, a symbol of the city-state, an image of a patron god, sometimes a brief phrase or value. For instance, Athenian tetradrachms bore the owl of Athena and were trusted across the Aegean. Corinthian staters showed Pegasus fast, reliable, and used for trade across the western Mediterranean. Rhodes used the head of Helios, a symbol of the island's solar cult, and by extension, its reliability. Coins were compact embodiments of trustworthiness, civic identity, and mobility. Hermes, who moved between cities, between meanings, and between people, was the unseen hand that gave coins their true value. He wasn't stamped on their faces, but he was invoked in the exchange itself. Weighing and measuring, the illusion of precision. Most coinage was based on weight silver, mostly measured in drachmas, obols, and minas. Merchants carried scales and counterweights, and buyers watched with suspicion. But even in a standardized system, variables crept in. Metal purity could vary. Weights could be shaved. Coins could be clipped or counterfeited. Hermes, ever the watcher of borders and margins, thrived in this world. His presence in weighing rooms and market stalls didn't ensure honesty, it ensured attention. Merchants believed that to cheat under Hermes' gaze was dangerous, but also possible if done with enough finesse. This is the key to understanding his place in commerce. Hermes was not a god of morality. He was a god of skillful ambiguity. If you cheated poorly, he might trip you. If you cheated artfully well, perhaps he smiled. The middlemen, brokers, interpreters, and risk-takers. Every large-scale market had intermediaries, caploi, retailers, amphora, long-distance traders, and brokers who arranged deals between buyers and sellers. These people were essential and vulnerable. They had no divine mandate like priests. They had no armies like kings. They lived on negotiation, relationships, and timing. These were hermetic professions built on fluidity and intuition. A broker had to read facial expressions, know regional dialects, adjust prices based on weather, rumor, or mood, smuggle goods without being caught or taxed. These were not holy men, but they kept economies functioning. And many of them kept a small Hermes charm worn or hung from a cart as a sign of professional loyalty. Because in their world, luck was often just preparation in disguise. Thieves as entrepreneurs. Let us return for a moment to Hermes, dual-role god of merchants and god of thieves. In many myths, Hermes steals sandals, cattle, dreams, even lovers. But he does so not from greed, but from curiosity and ingenuity. To the Greeks, thievery was not merely sin. It was a misused skill. A clever thief, one who didn't harm, who avoided violence, who made their living from trickery, was not always despised. They were sometimes admired, especially if their targets were powerful or arrogant. Thieves and smugglers prayed to Hermes before a job. Some even offered him a coin dropped at a herm, a cup of wine poured onto a rock, a whispered thanks after a successful escape. Why? Because Hermes understood them. He saw the line, and sometimes he let them cross it. Cultural exchange, commerce, and cosmopolitanism. As Greek trade expanded, so did exposure to new gods, customs, and ideas. Hermes, the boundary crosser, became a symbol of openness. He didn't just protect Greek traders. He was invoked by Phoenicians, Egyptians, and even Romans, who would later absorb him fully as Mercury. In border towns and port cities, shrines to Hermes often stood alongside foreign altars. Traders might leave offerings to multiple gods, hedging their bets, respecting local practice, blending belief with business. Hermes, by nature, adapted. He did not demand exclusivity. This made him the perfect god for an emerging Mediterranean world, plural, mobile, and negotiated. Commerce as a way of life. For many Greeks, especially outside the landed aristocracy, commerce was not shameful. It was freedom. A successful trader could rise socially. A clever broker could gain influence. A shipowner could fund public works and win political office. And in all these paths, Hermes was present. He didn't promise fortune, but he promised movement, and in a world where status was often fixed by birth, movement was salvation. This perhaps is Hermes' greatest commercial gift, not wealth but mobility. Now, as we picture a bustling port at sunrise, sails being hoisted, goats being loaded, arguments over dried figs echoing between stone walls, we see not chaos, but choreography. Hermes does not stop it. He doesn't even slow it. He simply watches. And we're left to consider. In a world where everyone is trying to gain something, is there such a thing as an honest deal or only a well-balanced one? We explored Hermes, deep integration into the daily life of trade, from coin-counting merchants and silver-scaled contracts, to thieves navigating moral loopholes, to travelers and brokers seeking favor in exchange for cunning. But now, in this final section, we step back from the stalls and coins to consider what Hermes and commerce meant for Greek identity itself. Because trade under Hermes' subtle guidance wasn't just an economic activity, it was a cultural lens. It revealed what a society valued. It shaped how people interacted. It determined where power lived, not in temples or palaces, but in conversation, movement, and risk. This final part of the story asks us to reflect not on what was sold, but on what was believed and how Hermes, in his quiet authority, presided over the most human part of all, choice. The marketplace as a moral arena. The agora wasn't just a place for material exchange. It was also where ethics played out, every day in small decisions. A seller could raise prices before a festival, knowing the poor had little choice. A buyer could pretend ignorance, haggling a widow into undercharging. A broker could choose to smooth over a deal that helped a friend or extract a bribe. These moments weren't judged by law. They were judged by reputation, ritual, and more quietly Hermes' gaze. Hermes, unlike Zeus or Athena, didn't punish immorality outright. But the Greeks believed that repeated dishonesty, particularly when done without cleverness or style, might draw his disfavor. And that disfavor rarely struck with thunder. It came in more mundane forms. A lost shipment, a stalled negotiation, a promising trade that dissolved into silence. To offend Hermes wasn't to incur wrath. It was to lose favor in a world of movement, a kind of quiet exile from opportunity. The Hermes, silent sentinels of exchange. No symbol captures Hermes' presence in commerce more clearly than the Herm. These modest stone pillars, often square, topped with a bust of Hermes and a prominent phallus, stood at thresholds, between cities, at street corners, in the agora, along trade routes. They were not elaborate statues, they were not temples, they were function before form. And yet their symbolism was rich. The face of Hermes watching all passers-by. The erect phallus, symbol of fertility, prosperity, and unashamed vitality. The stone form immovable, even as Hermes himself never stayed still. Travelers rubbed them for luck, traders left offerings at their base, children played near them, thieves sometimes whispered thanks. In Athens, when dozens of Hermes were mutilated in a single night, in 415 BCE, it caused mass panic, not just from fear of vandalism, but because the city believed it had lost Hermes' favor. The gods might live in the sky, but Hermes stood at the gate. The mythical economy, godly trade-offs. Beyond the agora, commerce crept into the myths themselves. Hermes traded the lyre for Apollo's forgiveness and gained his staff. He offered words in exchange for safe passage between realms. He brokered peace between gods with logic, not force. Even mythic diplomacy followed the Hermetic model, exchange over command. In a world where the gods fought, fell in love, betrayed, and negotiated, Hermes, value came not from strength, but from utility. He reminded the Greeks that no power lasted without compromise, that every war ended in a deal, that every gift implied a price. And that perhaps was the deepest truth of commerce. Nothing is truly free, not favor, not forgiveness, not even friendship. Hermes and the hidden hand. The more we examine ancient commerce, the more we see Hermes not as an active god but as a principle. He was invoked but rarely interfered. He was present but rarely dramatic. This subtlety became his greatest legacy. Hermes was not the voice of justice, but the engine of function. He taught that movement is essential, communication is survival, flexibility is wisdom, and that the line between virtue and vice is not a wall, but a thread. These were not divine decrees. They were working truths shaped and reshaped in each marketplace, each port, each handshake. The long shadow of Hermes. As Greek influence spread, so too did Hermetic thinking, though few called it that. Roman merchants invoked Mercury before contracts. Medieval traders made offerings at roadside stones. Renaissance thinkers praised Hermes Trismegistus not just as a god, but as a keeper of arcane wisdom and exchange. Enlightenment economists spoke of invisible hands and natural markets, echoes, perhaps, of Hermes' presence in movement and balance. Even today, Hermes survives in symbols. In the caduceus, twisted wrongly into medical logos but still present. In the winged shoes of postal services and delivery brands. In the very word hermetic, now used to describe sealed systems, ironic perhaps for a god of flow, but a reminder that once everything leaked into everything else. Final reflection: the market is us. We often think of commerce as cold, impersonal, even inhuman. But in ancient Greece, trade was anything but. It was messy, passionate, moral, humorous. It was a theater of status and skill. It was where the gods whispered not from altars, but from price changes, lucky finds, and the sly smile of a seller. Hermes was not a protector from this chaos. He was a god within it, not solving problems, but making sure they stayed interesting. He was the invisible middle, the negotiator, the watcher of hands as they passed coin, and eyes as they lied kindly. And perhaps this is the final lesson he offered: that commerce is not about winning. It's about knowing where to stand, when to speak, and how to move, when no one is watching, but everyone is deciding. Story 5. Boundary stones and boredom. The role of Hermes as Hermes Propylaos. The Greek gods are often remembered for their grand domains: Zeus for the sky, Poseidon for the sea, Hades for the underworld. Their power was vast and dramatic. But there is another kind of power, one that lies not in dominion but in definition, in knowing where something begins and where it ends. Hermes, ever the god of movement, change, and passage, was also the god of boundaries. As Hermes Propylaos, Hermes of the gateways, he stood not at the center of things but at their thresholds. He did not guard palaces or rule cities. He watched from the periphery. He was not there to dominate. He was there to observe, to protect, and occasionally to wink at the liminal chaos that occurs when one thing becomes another. This is the story of Hermes at the gate of boundary stones, street corners, sacred thresholds, and the curious power of being in between. Propylaos, of portals and porches. The Greek word propylon refers to a gateway, particularly the grand entrances to temples, courtyards, or acropolises. Propylaos, then, is one who stands before the gate. Hermes Propylaos wasn't just a title, it was a role. In this form, Hermes became the god who stood watch at thresholds of significance. You would find him at the entrance to a temple, marking the shift from mortal to sacred. At the front door of a home, signaling the move from public to private. At the city gates, mediating between citizen and stranger, law and freedom. Along roads, guiding travelers across invisible borders. These transitions were not dramatic. There was no divine lightning, but they were constant and necessary. The Hermes, geometry and the divine. Earlier, we mentioned Hermes stone markers with Hermes' head and often a prominent phallus. These were more than just religious shrines. They were boundary markers, both sacred and functional. Hermes were placed at city boundaries, road intersections, house entrances, marketplace edges. They didn't carry inscriptions or instructions. Their message was simpler: you are crossing into something else. In this way, Hermes defined space. And in defining space, he defined rules not by law but by location. Step past a Herm and you were no longer inside. The expectations changed. Your behavior might shift. Your language might soften or sharpen. This was Hermes at his most subtle, not guiding directly, but altering how space was understood. The boredom of boundaries. The title of this story includes a contradiction: boundary stones and boredom. What could be more uneventful than a rock at the edge of a field? But herein lies the brilliance of Hermes. While the Olympians wielded thunder, tridents, and spears, Hermes worked with stone blocks and invisible lines. He didn't stop wars. He watched as people crossed into them. He didn't inspire harvests. He stood quietly as people left offerings to hope for one. The boredom of boundaries is their everydayness, their repetition. And yet, every day, someone passes a threshold. Every day, someone leaves, returns, trespasses, or transitions. Hermes Propylaeus made those moments mean something. Not through spectacle, through presence. Sacred versus profane, the invisible wall. In Greek religion, boundaries between sacred and profane were not always clear, but they mattered. A misstep could invalidate a ritual. An unclean person crossing into a holy site could offend the gods. A poorly timed entrance could doom a sacrifice. Hermes managed these shifts. He didn't purify like Hestia. He didn't punish like Apollo, but he watched. His presence meant the transition was acknowledged. If a traveler stopped to nod at a herm, the threshold was respected. If a merchant made a small offering at a city gate, commerce was sanctified. These actions were mundane, but they were also rituals. They turned routine into recognition. And for Hermes, recognition was everything. Between opposites, the god of both and. One of Hermes' most fascinating qualities is his refusal to choose a side. He was a god of both commerce and theft. He served both Zeus and Hades. He crossed between Olympus and earth and the underworld. He protected both guests and hosts. At boundaries, these dualities were most evident. Consider a city gate. Inside, you are a citizen. Outside, you are a stranger. Crossing makes you vulnerable. Hermes makes you seen. He didn't erase the boundary, he made it negotiable. And this, more than anything, was his divine gift, not in enforcing borders, but in helping people cross them. Entrances and ritual protection. At homes and temples, small statues or plaques of Hermes were often placed near the door not as decoration, but as spiritual surveillance. He protected from evil spirits, from thieves, ironic, yes, but he favored skilled thieves, not crude ones. From bad luck, from impolite guests. The Romans continued this tradition with Mercurius Propylaeus, adapting Hermes into domestic worship. This was not about fear, it was about recognition. You didn't enter a home or holy place casually. You paused, you acknowledged the boundary, you honored Hermes. And in doing so, you prepared yourself to behave accordingly on the other side. Boredom as safety. There's another reason Hermes' role at boundaries feels uneventful, because boredom is a sign of peace. A city gate that opens and closes with no incident is a gate doing its job. A home that receives guests without misfortune has a functioning boundary. A herm that grows moss and gathers dust has been quietly effective. In this way, Hermes' boredom is not failure, it's success. He doesn't want attention, he wants flow. And the best kind of flow is one you barely notice, like water through a well-tuned aqueduct or traffic in a well-managed city. In being unremarkable, Hermes' presence at the threshold becomes the most reliable of all. A traveler at dusk, dusty feet, a heavy pack approaching a city gate, he stops, places a fig at the base of a herm, says nothing, walks on. He crosses the threshold not with ceremony, but with awareness. And we are left to wonder. When we cross boundaries of space, of status, of self, how often do we pause to recognize the moment, and who might be standing there, watching quietly? We stepped through the gateway, or rather, stood beside it with Hermes Propylaeus, watching as travelers, merchants, and citizens moved between the boundaries of sacred and profane, public and private, safety and risk. Hermes was not the gatekeeper in the traditional sense. He was not there to deny entry. He was there to witness, to observe, and perhaps most critically, to remind us that every passage has meaning. We go deeper into what it means to guard a boundary that isn't made of stone. We examine how Hermes' role as a liminal god shaped rituals, psychology, and identity in the ancient Greek world, and how these subtle roles, though often overlooked, were the connective tissue of society. This is the world of thresholds, not barricades of moments where things could go either way, and Hermes was the god who stood in that uncomfortable, essential in-between. Liminality, the power of almost. The anthropological concept of liminality, from Latin limen, meaning threshold, refers to the transitional phase in a rite of passage. It's a moment when an individual is no longer what they were, but not yet what they are becoming. The Greeks didn't use the word, but they understood the concept deeply, and Hermes embodied it. He was the god of adolescence between childhood and adulthood, diplomacy between peace and war, transition between places, roles, and even genders. Hermaphroditus, his child with Aphrodite, represented physical liminality, dreams between waking and sleeping, death between life and the afterlife. In these spaces, nothing was stable, and yet everything depended on them. Liminal phases were confusing, even dangerous, but they were also generative. Without transitions, there is no growth, and without Hermes, there is no guide. Threshold rituals, invisible contracts. Crossing thresholds required more than footsteps. It demanded rituals, small acts that marked the transition and asked Hermes to watch. Examples include placing a hand on a herm when leaving a city, acknowledging the protection left behind, and requesting safe travel. Pausing at a home's doorstep, especially before entering as a guest, to respect the boundary of hospitality. Touching or kissing a doorframe of a temple before entering, marking the step into sacred space. Pouring out a few drops of wine or oil at thresholds as an offering to Hermes to smooth the transition. None of these acts were grand, but they shifted awareness. They made people present. Hermes didn't enforce these rituals. He simply responded to them, or didn't if ignored. Psychological boundaries, Hermes and inner transitions. Hermes' role wasn't only geographic. He represented internal boundaries too. The first lie a child tells, a move from innocence to cunning. The first successful negotiation, a move from passivity to power. The first realization of mortality, a move from ignorance to awareness. In each of these moments, Hermes was imagined, perhaps unconsciously, as present. He is the god of language, after all, and language is what turns inner chaos into narrative, ambiguity into insight. In later philosophical traditions, especially among Hermetic thinkers, Hermes came to represent the messenger between the conscious and unconscious mind. The dream that teaches, the slip of the tongue that reveals truth, the clever thought that emerges from nowhere. All of these are Hermetic interventions. Hermes and the polis, defining who belongs. Cities in ancient Greece were surrounded by walls, but their real boundaries were social. To be a citizen meant inclusion in rituals, assemblies, and defense. To be a foreigner, metic, meant economic participation but legal limits. To be exiled meant removal not just from land, but from identity. Hermes stood at the edge of these distinctions. When citizens entered through the gates, they passed Hermes that reminded them. This city, this community, this identity was constructed. When strangers approached, Hermes offered a chance for welcome or, if ignored, a quiet sense of being unseen. He didn't judge, he recorded. He watched who was included and who was forgotten. Border incidents, when Hermes was offended. Hermes Propylaos was not prone to wrath, but when thresholds were disrespected, the Greeks believed consequences could follow. One of the most infamous examples was the mutilation of the Hermes in Athens in 415 BCE. On the eve of the Sicilian expedition, a grand and costly military campaign, unknown vandals defaced hundreds of Hermes across the city. Noses broken, phalluses shattered, faces chiseled away. The result? Widespread panic. The offense wasn't just vandalism, it was seen as a spiritual attack on Hermes, on safe passage, and on civic unity. Rumors flew. Political enemies were accused. The expedition proceeded, but it was cursed from the start, and ultimately, it failed disastrously. To the Athenians, it wasn't just poor planning or bad luck. It was the consequence of dishonoring boundaries. The edge as sacred space. We often think of sacredness being at the center: temples, altars, high thrones. But for Hermes, the edge was holy. At thresholds, you might meet someone new. You might confront a rule. You might glimpse something true. Hermes turned borders into possibilities. He made the beginning of a journey feel like a ritual. He made the end of a conversation feel like a decision. He made the act of walking through a door something worth noticing. This isn't about mysticism, it's about awareness. And in ancient Greece, awareness was survival. The role of stillness. For a god of movement, it's striking how still Hermes Propylaos is. He does not walk. He does not speak. He does not chase. He waits. He lets others decide whether they'll pause, notice, honor, or ignore. This kind of passive vigilance is rare in mythology. Most gods demand worship, fear, or glory. Hermes here demands only a moment. And in that moment, everything might shift. So now picture the edge of a village at dawn. A child crosses the threshold for the first time alone. She hesitates, looks at the old Herm beside the road, touches it, smiles, moves on. No thunder, no chorus, just movement marked. And we are left with a question. In our own lives, how many thresholds do we cross without realizing we are changing? And how might things be different if we stopped, even for a second, to acknowledge the God who stands quietly beside the way? We followed Hermes Propylaos through the gateways of cities and homes, through rituals and quiet moments of transition, through the invisible thresholds that separate roles, identities, and phases of life. We saw him not as a god of conquest or command, but as a companion at the crossroads, patient, observant, quietly sacred. But there is one threshold left to cross, the final and most absolute one in the ancient Greek worldview: death. Hermes Propylaos, when followed far enough, begins to blur into Hermes Psychopompos, the escort of souls. This third section completes our journey by examining how Hermes' role as a god of boundaries didn't end at the gates of cities or temples, but continued into the gates of Hades itself. And in doing so, we come to understand why a god of commerce, trickery, and messages was also entrusted with the most delicate transition of all, the one no one returns from. The gentle escort, Hermes Psychopompos. The Greeks feared death, but they also normalized it. Burial practices were highly structured, and improper rituals could mean a soul would wander restlessly. Enter Hermes not as a reaper, like Thanatos, or a judge, like Hades, but as a guide. As Hermes Psychopompos, literally soul guide, his task was to appear at the moment of death, escort the newly departed to the banks of the river Styx, ensure the soul reached Charon, the ferryman, ensure no soul lingered where it did not belong. Hermes didn't speak, he didn't weep, he simply led. And to many Greeks, that was a comfort. Death was lonely, Hermes made it less so. Threshold rituals for the dead. At funerals, the presence of Hermes was implied, even if unspoken. The dead were carried feet first out of the home, so their spirit wouldn't look back. Doors were sometimes anointed or swept after the body passed, a silent invitation to Hermes to help the soul move on. A coin was placed in or near the mouth, not just for Charon, but as a symbolic token of passage, a subtle nod to Hermes' domain of exchange. In this final threshold, everything returned to the patterns we've seen. A movement from one state to another. A ritual marking the boundary. A god Hermes acknowledging the change. But here, the threshold was absolute. Death as a liminal state. Death, like adolescence or travel, was understood as a liminal phase. The soul had left the world of the living, but had not yet reached its destination. In this space, Hermes alone could navigate. He passed between Olympus and Earth freely. He entered the underworld without resistance. He knew the terrain and its dangers. Importantly, he didn't judge. He didn't decide who deserved Elysium or Tartarus. That was the work of others. His job was simple: to guide. And this neutrality, this gentle ambiguity was deeply reassuring. Homecomings and farewells. Just as Hermes stood at the entrance of homes to bless arrivals, he also stood at the exit to witness departures. And not just in death. When children left home for the first time, families often invoked Hermes for protection. When soldiers left for war, offerings were made to Hermes at boundary stones or city gates. When exiles crossed the threshold into the unknown, they hoped even in bitterness that Hermes would go with them. He was not the god of staying, he was the god of leaving well. Hermes and the forgotten dead. In some versions of myth, Hermes was also said to retrieve souls who had died improperly without burial, without rites, without remembrance. These were the forgotten dead, unmarked, unhonored. Hermes, ever the god of the margins, did not ignore them. He found them, guided them, gave them place even in the shadowed halls of Hades. This aspect of his work made him one of the most beloved of gods, not for glory, but for grace. Thresholds as the real temples. By the end of a life, a Greek might have passed 1,000 thresholds. Into and out of cities. Across seas and stages of life. From childhood to citizenship. From marriage to widowhood. From health to decay. Each of these movements had its moment, its hermetic imprint. And so, while Hermes had no grand temple of marble and gold, his shrine stood everywhere. At street corners, by fields, at harbor entrances, at crossroads in the countryside, on gravestones. He was the god you saw without noticing until you needed him. And then he was simply there. Reflections at the last gate. Now let us return to a quiet scene. A dying man lies on a straw mat. His family has gathered. There is no more speech, only silence. Outside the home, the sun begins to set. A breeze stirs, a shadow passes, a dog lifts its head, then settles. No one sees Hermes, but he is there. He does not speak, he does not judge. He simply reaches out and guides the soul gently into the night. We began this story with boring, stones the Hermes at doorways and borders. We end with no stone at all, but with the presence of a god who defined the invisible space between what was and what comes next. And we are left with one final thought. In a world obsessed with arrivals and ends, do we forget the quiet holiness of the middle and the God who walks with us through it? Story 6. The messenger's mantle, language, lies, and the invention of diplomacy. We often think of diplomacy as a polished, modern art, full of embassies, treaties, suits, and scripted statements. But its roots go back to a time long before paperwork, to a time when language itself was raw, young, and often dangerous. In the ancient Greek world, language was not taken for granted. Words could curse, words could bless, words could end wars or start them. And at the center of this mysterious, potent exchange stood Hermes, the god of speech, messages, and negotiation. This is not the story of the loudest voices. It is the story of the most strategic silences, the well-placed phrases, the first emissaries, and the way Hermes taught humanity that language could move faster than armies and achieve more. Hermes, not just the messenger, but the message. Hermes is often described as the messenger of the gods, a kind of divine courier. But this is only partly true. He did carry messages, but more than that, he was the spirit of messaging itself. He embodied the swiftness of communication, the ambiguity of meaning, the artfulness of persuasion, the cleverness of spinning truth to advantage. In short, Hermes didn't just deliver words, he crafted them. When he delivered a divine decree from Zeus, he didn't speak it like a town crier. He shaped it for his audience, adjusted tone, omitted details, emphasized what needed emphasizing. Hermes was the god of diplomatic spin centuries before the word existed. The first negotiators, language in early Greece. Long before modern diplomacy, the Greeks practiced a form of informal negotiation between city-states, tribes, and clans. These talks were fragile. No central power guaranteed safety. No written contracts ensured follow-through. Everything hinged on trust, honor, and performance. Envoys were often chosen for their rhetorical skill, not their power, but their command of language. They carried verbal agreements, settled disputes, and navigated volatile conflicts. The gods were invoked constantly, and among them Hermes was key. Before crossing enemy lines, an envoy might pray, "Hermes, guide my tongue as you guide my feet." They weren't asking for victory. They were asking for control of timing, tone, and truth. The dual nature of speech. For the Greeks, speech was inherently two-faced. It could build trust or shatter it. Hermes embodied this duality. He was the god of truthful messages and of lies. He was the patron of eloquence and of deceit. He could resolve conflict or stir it subtly with just a phrase. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was complexity. To speak was to enter into a shared illusion that words represent reality. Hermes reminded the Greeks that this illusion was fragile and therefore powerful. Oaths and trickery. Language was also the mechanism for oaths, sworn promises, made sacred through speech. But Hermes, being Hermes, loved the space where oaths could be bent. One famous example comes from the Iliad, where envoys attempt to negotiate peace. The language used is carefully hedged and often contradictory. The audience knew diplomacy was theater, and Hermes was both playwright and actor. He blessed those who could lie with style, twist truth with grace, and emerge respected. He did not reward deception for cruelty's sake, but cleverness, properly deployed, was practically a form of worship. Silence as strategy. Hermes was also the god of knowing when not to speak. In myths, he often appeared as a quiet figure, choosing gesture over declaration, implication over instruction. The Greeks learned from this. A good negotiator wasn't the one who spoke most, but the one who understood what not to say, let others fill in gaps, used silence to unnerve or suggest strength. Hermes reminded them that silence wasn't absence, it was a kind of presence, a message with no words. Early treaties and the power of the spoken word. Before legal treaties were written on stone or papyrus, they were spoken aloud in the presence of witnesses and gods. Hermes presided over these moments. Two leaders would exchange oaths, possibly with a handshake. Hermes was also patron of handshakes. Offerings were made not to demand divine punishment, but to mark the sacredness of the exchange. The community was expected to remember the words spoken. Hermes was the guarantee, not by force but by expectation. Breaking one's word meant offending Hermes not through anger, but through elegance denied. Children of Hermes, the orators and envoys. As diplomacy became more formalized in the classical era, Athens and other city-states cultivated professional orators, men trained in rhetoric, logic, and public speaking. They were, in spirit, disciples of Hermes. They crafted arguments that twisted attacks into compliments. They made peace sound like strength and war like prudence. They understood how to influence without command. Hermes, though never named as their official patron, was present in every courtroom, assembly, and negotiation hall not as a deity, but as a method, a way of seeing communication not as transmission, but as creation. So we step back, and we see a world without microphones, or speechwriters, just two envoys, meeting at a dusty crossroads, words sharp as daggers, smiles thin. One of them wears a token of Hermes. The other carries no symbol but speaks with ease. A treaty is born, not because it's true, not because it's just, but because it's well said. And we are left with a question. In a world increasingly filled with words, how do we know when we're hearing the voice of Hermes and when we're simply listening to noise? We explored how Hermes helped language evolve from simple message delivery into a tool of influence. We saw how speech, once just a means of relaying information, became a form of strategy, persuasion, and soft power. Hermes stood at the heart of this evolution, not as a warrior or judge, but as a facilitator of movement of words across minds, promises across borders. Diplomacy is never just about quiet conversations behind closed doors. It must at times stand in the light at city assemblies, on stone platforms before skeptical crowds. In ancient Greece, this meant one thing: rhetoric. Here Hermes was not merely present, he thrived, for the battlefield of language was his true domain. The agora, language as action. In ancient Greek cities, especially Athens, the agora, the marketplace, served as a hub for commerce, politics, gossip, and public debate. It was loud, it was opinionated, and it was deeply hermetic. Why? Because the agora was the place where words were tested. You might announce a new alliance. You might propose a treaty. You might denounce a rival or rally the people to war. Every one of these was a performance. A speaker didn't just inform, he transformed. His audience might be moved to vote, to fight, or to riot. This was rhetoric at its peak, and Hermes, god of eloquence and guile, was always invoked, sometimes literally, but more often in technique. The rise of the sophists, disciples of Hermes. By the 5th century BCE, a new class of thinkers emerged, the sophists. These were itinerant teachers who taught young men the art of persuasive speech. Their lessons were controversial. They claimed to teach how to make the weaker argument appear stronger. They charged fees for instruction, a breach of traditional aristocratic values. They questioned the nature of truth itself. And yet they were immensely popular. The sophists didn't claim divine inspiration, but their approach to language was unmistakably hermetic. Flexible, strategic, rooted in perception over principle. To a sophist, words were not for expressing truth, but for shaping outcomes. To Hermes, this was not blasphemy, it was brilliance. Logos, pathos, ethos, tools of the divine messenger. Greek rhetoric would later be categorized by Aristotle into 3 appeals. Logos, logical reasoning. Pathos, emotional resonance. Ethos, credibility or character. Hermes used all 3. When calming Hera on behalf of Zeus, he used pathos, empathy, and flattery. When persuading Calypso to release Odysseus, he used ethos, divine authority, and calm reasoning. When tricking Argus Panops, he used logos, a well-spun tale that lulled the watchman to sleep. He was not a god of truth, but a god of effectiveness. And this, in Greek diplomacy, mattered more than being right. Negotiation without certainty. In modern systems, treaties are documented, signed, and bound by law. But in the classical world, especially in the early city-state period, negotiations lived in ambiguity. There were few written laws governing foreign relations. Memory and performance carried weight. Trust depended on how well something was said, not just what was said. A skilled diplomat might use conditional language: we are inclined. Our people seek harmony. It would be unfortunate if. No promises, just implications. Hermes encouraged this kind of language, the smooth, conditional, the artful dodge, the wink instead of the oath. It was not deceit, it was survival. Speaking with two tongues, when diplomacy fails. Not all rhetoric leads to peace. The Greeks knew this, and Hermes did too. Some of the most disastrous wars in Greek history were preceded by failed diplomacy where words, not weapons, set things into motion. The Trojan War began not with spears but with a failed embassy. Odysseus, speaking on behalf of Menelaus, tried to negotiate Helen's return. Priam's court refused. Hermes, invoked but unheeded, could not avert the coming bloodshed. The Peloponnesian War was riddled with false promises, shifting alliances, and elaborate speeches that concealed intentions. In this verbal fog, Hermes thrived, but few listened for truth. They listened for leverage. In these moments, Hermes ceased to be the god of peace or trickery. He became the god of unintended consequences. Not because he wished for conflict, but because he knew it was always possible. Foreign ambassadors, the risk of speaking on behalf of another. One of the strangest and most hermetic features of early diplomacy was the practice of sending others to speak for you. These speakers might be slaves, family members, or religious figures. They might be trained or untrained. Their words, however, bound the sender sometimes fatally. Hermes, as a messenger, always understood this danger. His cleverness was not in what he said, but in what he didn't commit to. A great diplomat in the Hermetic style left room for retreat. This was not cowardice. It was wisdom, the awareness that words, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. When speech becomes law. Eventually, as Greek legal systems matured, speech and diplomacy began to leave the realm of oral tradition and enter that of written law. But even then, Hermes remained. His statue still stood in marketplaces. His presence was invoked at trials, especially when oath-breaking was suspected. His symbols adorned decrees as if to say, "Let these words be swift but fair." In Rome, Mercury, his Roman counterpart, became patron of merchants, messengers, and diplomats, a reminder that Hermes had simply evolved with the times, not vanished. Even the Latin root of diplomacy from diploma, meaning folded paper, bore Hermes' legacy. For what is a folded document if not a sealed message carried between worlds? So we imagine once again. A crowded square. An envoy climbs the speaking platform. His cloak is simple, but his voice is clear. Around him, the crowd murmurs, skeptical. He raises a hand, begins to speak. Not loudly, not urgently, but precisely. Each word lands like a stone across a river, placed, not thrown. And we are left with a question. In a world shaped by speeches, how often do we ask, not who is speaking, but who taught them how to speak? We have followed Hermes from whispered secrets and artful negotiations to the crowded assembly halls of the Greek city-states, where public speech could raise empires or sink reputations. His touch was everywhere, in rhetoric, in lies disguised as truths, in truths disguised as opportunity. We saw how diplomacy was not just a function of politics, but a reflection of how humans use language to survive. We explore Hermes' legacy not just in myth, but in how his influence continued to echo through courts, empires, and everyday conversations. We will see how his sacred ambiguity laid the foundation for modern diplomacy, language theory, and even our understanding of truth itself. From myth to method, Hermes as archetype. Carl Jung in the early 20th century identified Hermes as an archetype, a symbol of the trickster, the mediator, and the transformer. Hermes was not bound by categories. He could cross heaven and earth, life and death, truth and lie, God and human. In diplomacy, this crossing is essential. A diplomat must navigate two worlds. Their own nation, with its goals, culture, and pressures. The foreign power, with its expectations and uncertainties. Hermes, in his core identity, mediates. He doesn't resolve conflict through force, he reshapes it through communication. In doing so, he prefigures every diplomat, negotiator, and even every therapist or mediator who works between people. Language as a tool, not a mirror. In the Hermetic worldview, language is not a mirror of reality, it is a tool that alters it. This challenges modern assumptions. We like to think of speech as transparent. Say what you mean what you say. But Hermes teaches otherwise. A word can conceal as much as it reveals. A silence can be louder than a confession. A sentence's meaning shifts depending on context, tone, and timing. Modern linguistics has come to similar conclusions. Theories like pragmatics, semiotics, and speech act theory reflect Hermetic principles. Words don't just describe, they do. Meaning isn't fixed, it's negotiated. Power lies not in vocabulary, but in use. Hermes knew all this thousands of years ago. He didn't invent language, but he showed us what it could do. The invention of written diplomacy. As we shift from the classical to the Hellenistic, and then the Roman world, diplomacy began to take on written form. Treaties were engraved in stone or recorded on tablets. Ambassadors traveled with credential-sealed documents verifying their status. Agreements were preserved, archived, and even referenced in future negotiations. And yet, even with written treaties, the spoken word remained dominant. Why? Because documents must still be delivered and interpreted and performed. This is where Hermes lingered. The Roman Mercury, Hermes' counterpart, became patron of scribes, orators, and heralds. But in secret, the Greeks still invoked Hermes when dealing with language's slipperier aspects, its loopholes, its flattery, its potential to unravel even the most finely carved treaty. Hermes and modern diplomacy. Though Hermes is rarely named in modern times, his shadow remains. Consider the protocols of 21st century diplomacy. Ambassadors must speak for their nations without overstepping. Negotiators use carefully crafted language to avoid direct offense. Treaties include strategic ambiguities, phrases like "as soon as practicable," "in good faith," or "subject to mutual agreement." These are not mistakes, they are Hermetic flourishes. Hermes lives in the parentheses, in the conditional clause, in the pause before the answer. Even email diplomacy, the carefully toned messages sent between states, the curated press statements carry the essence of Hermes. Diplomacy as human survival. Stepping back from politics, Hermes' teachings apply on a deeply personal level. All humans, every day, engage in a form of diplomacy. When we manage family tension, when we negotiate job offers, when we comfort a friend without giving false hope, when we apologize without losing face. In each case, we craft language, we weigh options, we seek outcomes not through coercion but through communication. This is Hermes' domain. He is not the god of deception. He is the god of navigation. He helps us move through difficulty rather than around it. Final reflections. Speech as the thread between us. Let us return to the image of Hermes as a weaver not of cloth, but of connection. In a world where armies can fail and borders can fall, it is language that keeps things moving. Between leaders, between cultures, between generations. Hermes doesn't guarantee peace. He doesn't even promise clarity, but he offers something better, possibility. He reminds us that speech, properly used, can open doors that would otherwise remain closed. Not because of brute force, not because of divine will, but because one person chose to say the right thing, at the right time, in the right way. And so we leave this story of Hermes not with a shout, but with a whisper, not with certainty, but with a carefully chosen question. In the maze of meanings, where every word could mislead or unite, will we like Hermes learn to walk softly, speak wisely, and listen as though the world depended on it?